Okay, thank you so much for bearing with us. We think we fixed all our technical difficulties in this live theater time on Zoom. So now let me again turn it over to Mordecai.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you again, everyone who's listening and watching, to our ASL interpreters and the whole CIIS Public Talks team. We're really grateful to be here with everyone and for your patience. So once again, we're here tonight to talk about the biopolitics of the medical industrial complex in pandemic times and why it's truly imperative to transform the medical industrial complex in these times and to really be able to understand families, our ancestors, really personally. So, to really honor the intensity of it and what people have survived or not survived, I just want to evoke that.
Sorry, Mordecai. Hold on. I'm so sorry. Give me one moment.
Wait, Kyle says it's working.
All right, please continue, Mordecai. It looks like we're back up.
Do you know the last thing that was heard by the audience?
Jump back to talking about the sensitive material. I think that was when it came back.
So we're back again, everyone. So as I was saying a moment ago, some of this content is intense. So we're going to honor the intensity and just be able to acknowledge that. I think one of the ways that we can best disrupt and position ourselves to transform the medical industrial complex is to acknowledge the pain so we don't participate in the logic of denial or invisibilization or the normalization of suffering or systemic oppression. And I will unpack some of those things as we talk further this evening. So the medical industrial complex puts profit and social control above saving lives and true health and healing. Many may claim, well, health and healing, it's hard to define, Mordecai. And I'm actually going to make a rather simple counter argument, for you to consider. And that's that, with health and healing, you know it when you see it, or more importantly, you know it when you experience it. In some ways, because the medical industrial complex so strongly produces and amplifies ableism, it's really occupied even our collective imagination of what real health and healing is. And ableism, like so many other types of systemic oppression, it can be internalized, and then in turn it becomes normalized, and then that results in its invisibilization. It's very hard to tell that it's there. So if we can realign to these truths of what health and healing is, and reclaim our right to know, be experts in our own skin amid the so-called laboratories of our lived lives, and know that we have the power and right to know and define what health and healing is for ourselves, our communities, our planet. This is really among the most crucial liberatory work we can be engaging in now. And I see it as a labor of love, profoundly generative, inherently healing, and work that will build our collective autonomy and capacity to co-create viable and sustainable alternatives to the medical industrial complex. So I'm really grateful and humbled to be here with all of you tonight so we can begin to act as catalysts in our own lives and community to start or continue this work, because certainly many of you are already engaged in this in so many ways. And in so many ways, our survival is this work and uplifts these aims in such profound ways. And it's crucial to not forget that. So in these specific pandemic times, how do these pandemic times urgently demand this work of us? So the pandemic has been exploited in highly calculated and strategic ways to further mobilize and cement the power of the alt-right in this country, in the US, otherwise referred to as Turtle Island by Indigenous people. And historically and currently, medical institutions and practices have been deployed to enforce and carry out far-right fascist and genocidal agendas. And in this talk, I will reveal how the medical industrial complex was actually designed for this and co-evolved with this, and has been intended to justify and advance the aims of white supremacy, ableism, patriarchy, Christian supremacy, and capitalist expansion. And they really all work together to ensure their success and a kind of chokehold over power and resources. So I want to take you through some information to really begin to give you all a sense of how this outpictures and manifests. And this is part of what the biopolitics of the MIC really are. So I'm going to begin by actually talking through some cancer prevalence statistics, and then look at how the MIC, the medical industrial complex, organizes treatment around cancer and other disease, especially with the engagement of big pharma and other multinational corporations connected to big pharma corporations. So we'll be able to see patterns emerging of how one of the ways in which the medical industrial complex functions to engage in this social control is that it's actually playing a significant causative role in the diseases and illnesses that is actually making money, huge amounts of money in treating. So this is one of the first dynamics that we'll be looking at. And you'll see that that ties into many of the other themes that I've already evoked. So according to the National Cancer Institute's 2020 statistics, 40% of people in the US will get cancer in our lifetimes. The MIC profits hugely from this. The National Institute of Health estimates that direct cancer treatment alone in 2020 cost $160 million. Evaluate Pharma, which is a financial analyst firm, estimated that total quote unquote oncology sales in 2008 was nearly $125 billion. And that's out of a total prescription market of $864 billion. Another big pharma analyst, Dialysis, projects that global sales of pharmaceuticals will exceed $900 billion this year. So that's nearly $1 trillion. So between 2010 and 2020, the cost of cancer care in the US has increased by 27%. And Evaluate Pharma also projects that oncology will have close to a 20% market share of pharma sales by 2024, exceeding 240 billion. So there's a way in which multinational big pharma corporations are really tied to chemical polluters, and how their very models are designed to create these types of vertical markets, those that I just mentioned, to ensure that the profit that they glean from producing pharmaceuticals to treat diseases is very, very high, and that simultaneously their business models are organized so that they're actually manufacturing products that are evidence to cause cancer and the other types of illnesses that they are creating huge revenue streams for treating. So Bayer Monsanto is actually a perfect example of this. As many of you may be familiar, Monsanto makes glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, and one of the most prevalent broad spectrum herbicides on the planet. In 2015, it was designated a probable carcinogen by the WHO, the World Health Organization. Excuse me. In 2016, it was found above recommended limits in 93% of Americans in an environmental working group study. In 2017, a longitudinal study that began in '93 and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that glyphosate levels in participants had doubled since 1996 and are well over the recommended limits, both here in the US and in Europe. And then finally in 2019, February of that year, a study by the University of Washington, which was actually the most extensive review of epidemiological literature to date, found that glyphosate increases cancer risk by 40%, especially of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So guess what company makes one of the few FDA-approved drugs to treat non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? Bayer Monsanto. In fact, this particular drug was fast-tracked by the FDA to treat late-stage of these types of cancer that were resistant to other therapies in 2019, just 1 year after the $66 billion merger between Bayer and Monsanto in June 2018. And just another example of how these types of toxins circulate in our environments and our body and generate huge amounts of profit for the medical industrial complex in multiple levels. Enlist Duo was one of the first pesticides to be fast-tracked for approval under Trump's EPA. And Enlist Duo is actually glyphosate plus one of the chemicals that was used in Agent Orange. So, you know, this is Trump's America, but it's also the biopolitics of the medical industrial complex as they have been. So one of the defining characteristics of the medical industrial complex that's very concealed from our view is that it's not just profit driven, but at every level, it incentivizes making people sick so it can profit from curing or treating us. I'm going to take a pause for a moment to just let that sink in. This isn't hyperbole or conspiracy theory. It's readily demonstrable fact. There's other things about Bayer Monsanto that illustrates and outpictures some other profound and chilling aspects of the medical industrial complex. Both of its history and how it functions in present time. So Bayer, you know, well known for aspirin, also has historic ties to a big chemical conglomerate called IG Farben, of which it was a member company. So IG Farben was responsible for creating Zyklon B, which is the chemical used to murder 3 million Jewish people, disabled people, Roma people, LGBT people, and communists in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other concentration camps. In 43 to 44, 6,000 people were murdered daily in Auschwitz. And the interned enslaved labor of Jewish, disabled, Roma, LGBT people, communists were used to actually build IG Farben's factory that was producing Zyklon B. And as many of you may know from knowing this history, even in some limited way, disabled people were among the first to be murdered. Bayer, BASF, another huge chemical corporation that still exists, and Hoiste made the chlorine gas that's notorious as being known as the gas cloud that was used in World War I trench warfare prior to joining with other big chem companies in 25 to form IG Farben. So IG Farben actually has deep ties to the founding institutional infrastructure as the MIC as we know it as well. Hold on one moment. I have a little dog here who is very much wanting to join the conversation. So perhaps, I'm not sure he was in the camera. Thank you everyone for that realness. So J.D. Rockefeller was actually a board member of IG Farben, and he is a well-known monopolist who is also a member of the Carnegie Foundation, which was responsible for commissioning the Flexner Report in 1910. And that report essentially resulted in the remaking of medical school education, and in many ways laid the groundwork for the institutional infrastructure of the MIC. So Rockefeller has a lot of ties and entanglements with this history that I think demonstrate a lot of what's crucial to understand about the MIC so we can really disrupt and transform it. Rockefeller also founded the Institute for Medical Research, which developed pharmaceuticals. So you can see that at the ground up, wanting to make sure that the pharmaceutical industry played a really big role in healthcare institutions was very, very important. He also funded the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which produced the United States' first eugenicist research, and also produced the world's first racial hygiene laws. Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's company, supplied IG-farben with tetraethyl lead, an essential ingredient of the gasoline used for Nazi fighter planes. After the Rockefellers, the next largest stockholder in Standard Oil was IG-farben, and this investment was actually part of a pattern of reciprocal investments between the US and Germany during the Nazi years. In 1928, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm's Institute for Eugenics, Anthropology, and Human Heredity was created. It was run by Ernst Rundin, Hitler's foremost racial hygienist, and the Institute's main financing came from Rockefeller. So this really just illustrates the extent to which this eugenicist project, an ecocidal project, a profit-driven project is all really part of the founding institutions of the medical industrial complex. There's also a chilling statistic that the UN Chemical Outlooks report published in 2019, and that's that in 2017, the global chemical industry was worth more than $5 trillion. And by 2030, this is predicted to double. So I think for me, this highlights the urgency of really understanding, exposing, and transforming the medical industrial complex because of its complicity with so much of the decline of health, so much of the decline of individual and collective community power, and the degradation of our ecosystems. It's hard to imagine a livable world if the amount of chemical toxins circulating in our environments double in just 10 years. So, at this point, you may ask, Mordecai, please give us a simple, succinct definition of the medical industrial complex, and I think on some levels, rather than a succinct definition, although I will give you that in a moment, one of the best ways to define the MIC is to really reveal all of its interlocking parts. Look at how it behaves, its rationales, its practices, the embedded, normalized, invisibilized systems of oppression, the legacies of the enslavement of Black lives and bodies, and the attempted genocide of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, upon which it's built, and its impacts upon every aspect of our lives, well beyond the doctor's office or our healthcare plans, or even the all too lethal battles we must wage, or we've had to wage with health insurers for access to basic care, even before the pandemic. The MIC is a set of entangled institutions, scientific disciplines, mindsets, and practices that interact with and bear upon all domains of society to control and manage the delivery of healthcare, and acts as the most authoritative arbiter on what constitutes health and illness, what constitutes normal and deviation, what constitutes legitimate diseases and treatment, and really who is worthy of care and life itself. So just circling back to the pandemic in these times, there's other chilling facts that define this moment that I think we're all too aware of. So over 200,000 people have perished from COVID-19 in the US. On Friday, the 25th, 55 new people were diagnosed with COVID-19. That is a huge amount. That's the greatest number for, I think, the last 3 months. And I just want to say, notice I didn't say 55,000 new cases. That type of depersonalizing language is common in public health talk, but it really erases from our awareness that each of these quote unquote cases are actual people, each one beloved, precious, immeasurably valuable, and irreplaceable. So that's one of the ways that we can disrupt the way the system functions, is to just really honor the loss. I think one of the things that was most despicable and painful of the really brief amount of the debate that I listened to yesterday, and truly it was only about 3 minutes because that's about all I could take, and also I had to teach, was the way in which Trump was just very, very casually engaging in not just of gaslighting, but profound dismissal of the huge pain and loss that people in this country and globally have been facing just regarding the pandemic alone. That's not even speaking to the intensification of racialized violence, police violence, or the many other things that we will touch upon in a few moments. So, just the normalization of, he was just like, oh, well, not that many people have really died, and it's really just older people and people with diabetes or heart conditions, and, not that many children or young people. So this casual way, to just speak of, oh, those disposable people, those people that are already inherently flawed, like that expression of intersectional ableism, because of course, there's such a high proportion of Black people in the US and Latinx people in the US and disabled people of all races that have been most impacted by COVID. So that casual dismissal is really shows some of the dynamics of these times as well. So as you also probably know, we have over 7 million people have or have had COVID in the US, and we're leading the world in cases and deaths. And we're followed most closely by Brazil and Russia, which I think should give us all pause. There's certainly a pattern that emerges. And that is a pattern that draws our attention to the political context in those countries and the edging towards, or arguably, in some places like Russia, the dictatorship or the fascist overtaking that's happening in those places. And, if you contrast the response to COVID to other places in the world, you can really see the extent to which the pandemic here has been exploited to push a eugenicist agenda, and the way in which the medical industrial complex enforces and carries this out. And, it's playing a role in edging us closer to a full racist dictatorship. I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm just trying to draw our attentions to the real risks that we're facing. And a couple of great examples are Morocco and Sudan. Morocco, very soon after the pandemic began, essentially invoked what is the equivalent of the Defense Production Act. And there was no fanfare or discussion or controversy. Factories were just redeployed immediately to mass produce personal protective equipment, or PPE. So guess what happened? There was only slightly over 2,000 deaths there to date. And Sudan made testing readily accessible, as early as mid-March, fast testing, very easy for people in the country to be able to access. The death toll there, only 836. So the contrast is vast, and even prior to the pandemic, our communities have been being attacked and divided on several fronts. And this, as noted scholar of fascism, Jason Stanley, has talked about recently, fascism uses a lot of tactics and plays the long game. So Hitler's rise to power took about 5 to 6 years, and so did the full-fledged onslaught of the genocide in Rwanda, but both contexts deployed similar rhetoric to what's being used by Trump and this administration, which I think we could actually accurately call a regime. So, what are some of the ways that our communities are being attacked and have been? One, I think, that is crucial to mention, because it is in fact a public health crisis, is the lethal targeting of Black and brown people, the majority of whom are also disabled by the police. So when police officers shoot a young Black father 7 times in the back in front of his children, as they did with Jacob Blake, or they shoot into an apartment 34 times and a young woman, Breonna Taylor, is murdered, This exemplifies police forces behaving as domestic terrorists and, engaging in acts of violence that function as collective punishment and are profoundly and collectively traumatizing. And it's not just me that's saying this is a public health crisis. Clearly, Black Lives Matter and our communities, are demanding that this is recognized as the horrific crisis that it is. But I think something that's pivotal and hopeful, and I'll take a little bit of a pause now to kind of evoke the potential of this moment, is that something has happened in the medical industrial complex since its monopolist roots, or even its roots prior to that in transatlantic slavery and attempted genocide of Indigenous people, that the MIC and healthcare workers have been democratizing over the last 20 to 30 years. So there's more and more Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are healthcare workers at all levels, including doctors and research scientists, more women, more queer, trans, and non-binary people, more disabled folks. So now this is a moment when we need them most as our accomplices. And they're there. They're in the belly of the beast, able to begin to question what's happening from the inside and begin to amplify the demands of communities most impacted. And a great example of this is an organization I have the gift to work with as well, called the Do No Harm Coalition, that is based here in the Bay Area, which is, I'm tuning in from Oakland, otherwise known as Ohlone Territory or Hoi Chin. So that's where Do No Harm is based as well. And they do a lot of great work. Please look them up if you're interested in learning more. And if you are a radical healthcare worker who's located in the Bay Area, please join their work. There's actually chapters that are starting up around the country. So yeah, if that's you, please do research them. But one of the projects that they've done in the past was called the Justice Project, and it's a study of the impact of collective trauma on Black communities due to police terrorism. That's like just an example of some of the opportunity and the power and potential of this moment. But, let's segue back to what we're up against. But, don't lose that hope. Remember how it feels in your body, because I really want everyone who's listening or watching to be able to carry that forward from this talk, to be able to, so you can feel supported to action, because we all have a role in this great work if we choose it. So, coming back to this moment, what we're seeing characterizing these times, and what we're seeing as an intensification of these eugenicist attempts being deployed by the MIC, is a normalization of eugenics that's such a huge part of ableism via the justification of medical rationing. So one such example of this that's very painful is the recent death of Michael Hickson, who was a 46-year-old disabled man living in South Austin, Texas. And he had a very severe heart attack. And as a consequence, he had cognitive impairment and he was a quadriplegic. But, so he had some health complications from that, understandably, but he was living a good life, incredibly loved and cherished by his wife and 4 children. But he came down with COVID, so he was admitted to the hospital. And his wife, Melissa Hickson, almost immediately got into a struggle with the doctors providing his care, because they essentially claimed that, quote unquote, his quality of life, Michael's quality of life, he doesn't really have much of one. And that direct quote was captured on tape by Melissa Hickson, because she became very mistrustful of the doctors pretty immediately, and actually recorded a conversation that's now been widely publicized in the media. But essentially what happened was Melissa agreed with the doctors that she and Michael didn't want for him to be intubated, but she did request that he receive other life-saving treatment, such as food, water, oxygen therapy, and medicine. And essentially the doctors and the state of Texas intervened and refused this, essentially killing Michael Hickson by letting him die. So Texas decided that they shouldn't have to use resources to try to save someone with Michael's disabilities. And it's a profound loss. Oftentimes when I talk about Mr. Hickson, I just actually start crying. And this is an example of the way that the state and the medical industrial complex are able to carry out this eugenicist project and they're able to enforce this rendering of someone's life as being unworthy of living. This is an extreme example of racialized medical ableism, being heightened, really exposed, and yet justified in these pandemic times. So the right and the ability of the medical industrial complex to manage and administer life, to wield the ultimate authority of who lives and who dies and our quality of life is really what Michel Foucault meant when he initially proposed the term biopolitics, that I've been evoking, throughout the entire conversation. And all of these complex dynamics we've been discussing are the outpicturing, the manifestations, and the impacts of biopolitics. So, where do we really go from here? And what are other ways that this is impacting us in this moment? The PPE and ventilator scarcity have been really part of the way in which this has been normalized. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how this quote unquote scarcity has come to be. So as of last week, over 1,150 healthcare workers have died of COVID-19 due to inadequate PPE, personal protective equipment. And rationing and shortages are still commonplace in hospitals all over the country. And there's been a lot of fuzzy facts and obfuscation of facts and alt facts around how this has happened. Because the reality is that we in the United States, we could have had a response that looked like Morocco's or Sudan's or New Zealand's or Thailand's or Taiwan's. There's many ways that we could have responded. But unfortunately, the MIC has already been designed for scarcity to leverage that as a form of social control and assurance of highest profits. So what you see when you look deeply at how this quote unquote scarcity has come to be is that there's hospital administrators at every level across the country, who have been firing nurses and other healthcare workers for bringing in their own PPE or for wearing N95s for procedures for which it wasn't deemed medically necessary, or refusing to procure masks due to too high of a cost per unit, or refusing to take mask donations. I have a colleague that I work with in the Health Justice Commons, who's one of our rad docs, who is one of the members of the Radical Telehealth Collective that we're starting, that we've begun as a response to the pandemic. And he's situated in Tacoma, Washington, and he has shared with me and others that the hospital that he works in received hundreds of mask donations that are literally just put away in a locked room that healthcare workers are not allowed to access. But more importantly, the Trump regime has made very clear decisions which have led to thousands of unnecessary and preventable deaths and needless preventable sufferings. And one of the most well-documented examples of this was picked up by news outlets as diverse as Vanity Fair and Business Week. And that's a meeting that took place on March 20th of this year, so very early on in the pandemic. And this meeting brought together public health experts, Silicon Valley funders, and CEOs from many corporations, including Mary Barra, who's the CEO of GM. All these people came together and they were basically like, we're ready to throw down. We are ready for the Defense Production Act, deploy our factories to make PPE, to make ventilators. We can save communities, we can save lives. The representative for the Trump regime at this meeting was Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law. And he said, no, you all don't understand business. You don't understand how capitalism works. and we're not going to do this. All of the different localities and states are going to fend for themselves, especially because the areas that are most hardest hit by the pandemic are blue regions, are blue states, are Democrats. So there was a clear decision that was very horrifically politically motivated very early on by the Trump administration, that you can just see that pattern play out again and again and again. That's just one of the most heightened examples. You know, and there's other ways in which these biopolitics of the MIC are playing out in very, very heightened ways. And we already mentioned the public health crisis of racialized police violence that has preceded and also has continued to worsen and become more intense throughout the pandemic. The biopolitics of the medical industrial complex is also defined by the bidirectional entanglement and amplification of power and control of the prison industrial complex. And the MIC uses carceral confinement and medical torture in its own institutions and across other quote unquote carceral complexes. And when I say carceral complexes, I mean institutions such as jails or prisons or ICE detention centers that are really part of these systems of quote unquote criminal justice and confinement. So this has been brought to our attention in intense and painful but crucial ways recently by Dawn Wooten, the whistleblower who is a nurse stationed in the Irwin Detention Center in Georgia. So what Dawn informed the public about was two huge things. One was very high and unnecessary and coercive amounts of sterilizations on Spanish-speaking women or people with uteruses. And the other was a complete mishandling and public health crisis around COVID in these institutions, in these ICE detention centers. And you know, it's important to know that Irwin Detention Center is run by LaSalle Corrections, and they own and run 13 other ICE detention facilities across the South. And I think Dawn Wooten's words to our communities when she became a whistleblower are so powerful. So I'm going to evoke them now for all of us. She said, "I became a whistleblower. Now I'm a target, but I'll be a target anytime rather than staying a part of an inhumane system." So again, another bright spot, a spot of resistance and potential is that there's so much conscientious objection happening within these institutions. You know, another thing that's very painful is that Dawn Wooten estimates that at least 50 people who are interred in Irwin Detention Center have COVID, and that at least 13 workers do. And in fact, the health services administrator of Irwin Detention Center who had hired Dawn, Marion Cole, died of COVID. So it's really, there's so much tragedy unfolding. You can see the way in which that medical industrial complex is so complicit in it. And, you know, you may know some of the back history of eugenics in this country. It is not new. I was able to talk a little bit about that history and how it relates to the founding of the MIC and regarding the Rockefellers and other monopolists that I named. But the first eugenics legislation to legalize forced sterilization of those unfit and disabled was in 1907 here in this country in Indiana, followed by California and 28 other states. And during the period of 1907 to the mid 40s, over 70,000 people, mostly Black, brown, poor, and disabled people were forcibly sterilized. And Hitler boasted that he looked to these laws and the eugenics program in the US to quote unquote inspire the Nazi program. Now, nominally, eugenics ended in the US in the mid 40s in response to the horror of Nazism, but we can clearly see the way that it continues. And the MIC allows it to continue by degrees in other contexts, you know, in our institutions that are part of our lives and our world. Another example of this that precedes the pandemic is the legalization of transvaginal ultrasounds. It's really more specifically the legal mandating of the use of transvaginal ultrasounds for people that have uteruses and vaginas that want to have an abortion. So this legislation is law in Kentucky and Virginia and several other states, and it basically mandates a person who wants to have an abortion that you have to have an invasive procedure in which a sonogram device is inserted into your body. It's painful, it's medically unnecessary, and then also as part of this legislation, the medical practitioner who's working with you is forced, mandated by law, to narrate what they're seeing on the sonogram image. And if they don't do so, they can lose their license to practice medicine. So you can see this way in which a very patriarchal agenda is inserted. I apologize for the poor choice of words there, into our medical practices and normalized, you know, not recognized as coercive, even though it's very clearly medically unnecessary. And it's, you know, it's a way that the autonomy of doctors is even undermined, or other healthcare practitioners that might be doing these procedures. I think, you know, in connection to that, in connection to reproductive justice and reproductive health, the impending installment of Amy Barrett as a new Supreme Court justice is another huge issue for us to be aware of. You know, Amy Barrett is a member of a highly conservative Catholic organization, but what's most disconcerting about her is that, you know, she is coming with a very extremist right-wing agenda. So if in fact Barrett is installed to the Supreme Court, then she is been voted in by November 10th, then she will be one of the Supreme Court justices presiding over California versus Texas, which is the case that could repeal the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. Now, if that were to happen, 30 million people will lose healthcare across the US, according to the Economic Policy Institute, and over 1.2 million people outside of the health sector could lose their jobs. I'm sorry for the background noise, everyone. Someone is setting off fireworks in the background, which is causing a little bit of dismay on my dog's part. Hold on one moment. Thank you for that moment of realness, everyone. So I will just repeat what I just said. So the Economic Policy Institute forecasts that if the ACA is repealed, 30 million people will lose healthcare across the US, and over 1.2 million people outside of the health sector will lose our jobs. So, you know, these patterns of withholding of healthcare, especially healthcare related to reproductive health and justice, or foisting it upon people coercively, you know, forcing sterilization on people. These are methods used to deploy social control and really enforce white supremacy, patriarchy, and ableism. And, you know, forced sterilization has a long history of use as a genocidal tactic of war, including against Indigenous women in this country. And Jen Deerenwater, a Two-Spirit disabled journalist and researcher of Cherokee Nation descent, writes about this extensively. So that's a great resource for this. But what these dynamics really show us is the way in which, also across histories and into present time, these tactics of wartime violence have been transported into the medical industrial complex and across carceral systems and normalized as legitimate or necessary. You know, so that's kind of helps us sum up and understand how we got here, and exposes some of the medical industrial complex's hidden histories. You know, by design, the medical industrial complex is white supremacist and eugenicist at its roots. it was created as an interlocking set of quote unquote vertical industries by monopoly families to ensure maximum profit and social control, not unlike the fossil fuel, chemical, or related industries. And in fact, you can see the way that they're entangled from some of the prior examples and histories that I laid out. I want to, as I'm beginning to wrap up and come to a place where I'll take as many questions as possible, I want to bring in some very, very helpful and powerful resources and guides in learning more about these topics and engaging in this work more deeply. So Harriet Washington is someone who I would really love for you to all be familiar with. Harriet is the author of the really loved and very important book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to Present. And she wrote a great many books. Many of them are award-winning. She also more recently wrote A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and the Assault on the American Mind. And she actually has another book that will be coming out soon, so keep a lookout for it. But one of the really powerful things that Harriet Washington did in Medical Apartheid is she was one of the first people to expose J. Marion Sims, who many of you may be familiar with as the quote unquote founding father of the medical subdiscipline of gynecology. And what she revealed for our communities, for activists, for organizers, is the extent to which J. Marion Sims engaged in coercive experimentation and medical torture of enslaved Black women and also poor immigrant women in order to kind of create his techniques and technologies for that discipline. So that's just an illustration of not just the white supremacy and the patriarchy that's really embedded in the system, but the way in which it's intrinsically entangled with how knowledge has been accumulated and how it's been so abstract, how knowledge has so painfully been extracted from our communities. And that's just a part of how the MIC has accumulated its knowledge. Another great academic that I want to bring to everyone's attention is Ruha Benjamin, who has authored many books and is doing a lot of work in data justice right now, and has done a lot of work in bringing an abolition mindset to health justice and healing justice. So her work is really powerful. One of the articles of hers that I really love is Catching Our Breath, Critical Race, Science and Technology Studies and the Carceral Imagination. And this, there's a lot of aspects to this piece, but it overviews the racist history of the spirometer, which is a device used to measure people's lung capacity. If you have asthma or you know someone that does, you have seen a spirometer, I guarantee it. And the work also borrows heavily of the research of Lundy Braun. So hold on one moment. And we're back. So in the history of the spirometer, it was actually built by a man named Cartwright because he wanted to study the differences in lung capacity in enslaved Black people and white people to be able to quantify it precisely. And again, this illustrates the dynamics, these founding dynamics of the MIC. So according to Cartwright and his quote unquote findings, the deficiency of Black people was 20% in comparison to white people. So that this deficiency was actually a defining characteristic of Black people. And this is an example, not just of the creation of racist medical technology, but also of the way that race is encoded in a biological essentialist way that is completely outside of reality and real bodies. But what this has resulted in essentially is that because of this calibration, even to this day, a person who is Black would have to exhibit more lung capacity loss in order to be documented as having a diagnosis or needing or being deserving of care, because there's a metric that's set that Black Americans have less lung capacity in comparison to other quote unquote races. So this is another reason why even social justice oriented practitioners struggle within the medical industrial complex, because there's the embedded layers of white supremacy and gender injustice and ableism. Another example of similar racist parameters exists for threshold of illness for kidney disease in Black Americans, making it slower and harder for kidney disease to be diagnosed in Black Americans, and slower and harder for Black Americans to receive dialysis or to become eligible for transplants. This is actually an issue that many of the fine people that I work with the Do No Harm Coalition have been working to expose and disrupt. So I want to thank them for their work. Another excellent resource for the breaking down the racism and eugenicist logics of different realms of medicine is the Institute for Justice and Healing, and you can find their executive summary on their website. Another excellent resource is Dr. Alondra Nelson's Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. And a couple more things. I suggest to all of my students and people in my communities with whom I'm learning and organizing as required reading for our times, I highly, highly recommend Sins Invalids Disability Justice Primer 2nd edition, which you can also find on their website. And then another excellent resource is the Changing Frequencies podcast, and they will also be releasing a medical industrial timeline soon. So again, really powerful resources. So great, I just got the information from the amazing CIIS Public Talks teams that we have 10 minutes for the Q&A, and that is a perfect amount of time for me to reflect with all of you, or begin to do so, because I think this is just the beginning, or for many of you, a continuation of the powerful work that you're already doing. What is to be done? What can we do in this moment? And it's so important that we work to transform and unlearn internalized ableism, and that we work to reimagine health and healing from the framework of collective liberation. It's crucial that we honor and uplift ancestral and Indigenous knowledge and practices, in these times. And I think, in some ways, health justice is most centrally about reclamation. It's about reclaiming our bodily autonomy, our authority and power to define for ourselves and our communities what health truly means, and understand that health is, necessarily a collective endeavor, and it's something that is contingent upon our environment and our social institutions. It is a process of healing and justice that requires justice in all realms of society. This hyper compartmentalization of health to an individual body is a white supremacist, kind of male supremacist, ableist myth. So we need to be able to eject that and align with what's really true, and recenter to our expertise about our own bodies, and our very embodiments, our bodily needs, and that of our loved ones, our communities, humanity as a whole, and the planet. So what are 4 major demands or aspirations that we can set upon this new kind of imaginative horizon if we clear out all of the intersectional oppression that is spun and that we're indoctrinated into because of the MIC? What does that look like? So I would say, again, understanding, exposing, challenging, transforming ableism, especially medical ableism and racialized ableism, is work that we all need to be doing now. And disability justice needs to be understood and centered in all of our work at all levels. So if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a climate justice organizer, whatever walk or role of life, for those people that are people that use wheelchairs that are listening, whatever walk or path of life that you are in, engage in this work of challenging and transforming ableism and centering disability justice. And the DJ Primer, the Disability Justice Primer that I mentioned a few moments ago, is a great resource for that. And I hope I've provided some good information in this talk as well. Another demand is the democratization of science and all its translational applications across disciplines and technological innovations. So we need people science. We no longer can tolerate science being elite or the purview of corporate power. Science needs to center the precautionary principle, and it needs to center broad public oversight and participation. All scientific institutions should become collectives. They should be worker-owned co-ops of some form. I mean, that's another huge piece of this. In order for us to successfully dismantle and recreate the MIC, we're going to have to massively transform capitalism and how our economy functions. So transformative economics is a huge part of this. We also need to abolish the chemical big agro industry in its current form. And we need to work towards a moratorium on new chemicals, especially pesticides, herbicides, solvents, and volatile organic chemicals. That doubling from 5 to 10 trillion in the next 10 years that was predicted by the UN report that I referenced earlier, we really need to forestall that from happening. As I mentioned, we need to collectivize healthcare institutions, including big pharma, and healthcare institutions in which people are providing care to community members. So I think that we should have networks of worker-owned co-ops by healthcare workers. So people that are curanderas and people that are cardiologists are working with horizontalism, equality, deep respect. We're able to actually disrupt and transform the commodification of these ancestral healing systems. And we're able to let healthcare workers also be the administrators and also design these institutions. And we need to shift, obviously, from profit to disability justice and climate justice principles. And disability justice is always intersectional. So it challenges racism and sexism and all the other systems of oppression that comprise ableism and uphold it. And we really need to center and set into motion medical reparations for Black and Indigenous people and their families, first and foremost, then other people of color and other survivors of all classes and races of medical torture and abuse, of which I'm one myself, which is part of why I've been so called to do this work with all of us. And then I'll just finally say, before I pass it over for the Q&A, which I'm really excited for, remember how powerful love is as a revolutionary tool and practice. We have to love ourselves and one another and love the vision and the dream that we're holding for one another. And there is healing and power in that, especially in these times. So with that, I will thank you all so deeply, and we will move to the Q&A, I believe. Yeah, I think we're ready for the Q&A.
You can open that tab at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A, and we'll be putting the questions in there as fast as we can type.
Excellent. I can do that. I'm doing it now. So the first question I see is that what is the best way to get directly involved with grassroots organizations or support progressive federal and state policies which champion these issues? Well, that is an excellent question. So, I mentioned before If you are a healthcare worker or healer, then there's many different organizations doing this work that you can do as a healer or healthcare worker. So, you know, as I mentioned, the Do No Harm Coalition has chapters here in the Bay Area, Ohlone Territory, or other places across the country. There's also many chapters of White Coats for Black Lives in many different medical schools across the country. So again, if you are a medical student or a nursing student or a phlebotomy student, you know, you can join one of those organizations. There's other ways to get involved as well. There's national organizations such as National Nurses United. So you can support the work of nursing unions across the country. You could get involved with organizations like mine, Sins Invalid, or the Health Justice Commons. Both of those organizations welcome members and volunteers to get involved. I mentioned the Institute for Healing and Justice as well. So those are just a few examples of organizations with which you could get involved. If you are interested in addressing these issues from the perspective of racial justice, then SURGE is an organization that has national chapters across the country, and that's Standing United for Racial Justice. I think those are a few examples. Hopefully that was helpful. If you need, if you want a little bit more specificity based on your interest or your geographical location, then you can put in a follow-up question and I'll do my best to get to it. So let's see. Okay, so the next question is, with the emergence of corrupt pharmaceutical companies and oppressive policies, are there any trustworthy healthcare agencies out there? That is a good question. I mean, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think there are healthcare organizations that are trustworthy, and a lot of organizations are organized by people most impacted. So those are the ones that I would recognize that I would recommend as the most trustworthy. So nursing unions, they're trustworthy, you know, because they are doing that frontline work and they're committed to caring for their patients or people receiving care in the best possible ways. And often are organizing around racial justice and climate justice goals and aims. So I think, you know, there really are a lot of trustworthy resources, but I think, you know, should you trust the warning information of pesticides produced by Bayer Monsanto? No, you know, absolutely not. And if you have a background if you are a person that actually reads medical literature, then what I would recommend is that you actually you research the background of the researcher to make sure that they don't have any affiliation to big lobby groups or big chemical corporations, because sometimes you have to dig a little bit to find those ties, but if you do that, you can find it. And there's a lot of those ties and entanglements as well, because you know, just as an example, the American Chemical Council is a huge, essentially lobbying agency that has hundreds and hundreds of chemical corporations in it. And they also have a research laboratory for endocrine disrupting substances that is contracted by the CDC for research. So that you have to look very closely at these ties. And that just shocks me, that the so-called independent research that the CDC is supposed to be engaging in is actually being supplied by an industry front group. But unfortunately, when you look close, you do see those dynamics, and that's other outpicturings of the MIC. So I think cultivating this critical lens will help you evaluate which resources are trustworthy. And, then just my last comment regarding this is that, there's patient advocacy groups as well that are more trustworthy. So if you're like, I'm interested in, trustworthy resources around insulin and care for people living with diabetes, then go to those organizations that are run by people living with diabetes and are advocating for more cost-effective care and other rights for people living with diabetes. Those are trustworthy. Thank you for that question. I hope that was helpful. The next question is also a great one. Are there international and/or Indigenous examples of health and healing that we should look to as a way to subvert the medical industrial complex? I mean, certainly, I think that in almost any place in which people live, there's traditional healers that are practicing their own lineages. And I think it's always wonderful to support them. So there might be traditional acupuncturists or Ayurveda practitioners or curanderas. So I think, it's always powerful to be able to support them, to receive care from them, because then, your resources are going directly to healers. I think that I'm trying to think of some other good examples. Another organization that I have the gift of working with here in the Bay Area is called Movement Generation. And they actually have a radical healers project that's part of Movement Generation that's called the Healing Health Collective. And that is a collective of mostly Black and Indigenous people of color healers, also healers that are disabled, that are queer and trans and non-binary. I'm actually a member because in addition to doing this work, I'm a somatic practitioner and I also do other energy work type things. But so something like that would be a great thing to support and to receive care in that way. And then finally, if you're looking for more kind of like a traditional mental health resource of a therapist, then a wonderful resource is the National Queer and Trans Therapist of Color Network. They have networks of practitioners all over the country. So wherever you are, especially in the times of the pandemic, you can connect with a practitioner, and you can support practitioners who are queer and trans and Black and Indigenous and people of color. So that's an excellent question. There are resources out there. One final resource I'll say for that is also Generative Somatics, which is another, it's a somatics organization, and they are predominantly Black and Indigenous and people of color organization with also many queer and trans and non-binary and disabled people of healers. Yeah, so I hope those are helpful resources for you. Thank you so much for your question. This next question is, how can marginalized people equip themselves with the knowledge and tools necessary to be able to better advocate for their needs while navigating the medical industrial complex? That is an excellent question. Thank you so much. So my organization does some of that work of training people how to be empowered to be medical advocates and how to understand the MIC and be able to survive within it. And there are also a lot of excellent toolkits that are available right now. The #NobodyIsDisposable website has a lot of excellent resources for people to help you navigate healthcare, especially during the times of COVID. And also there's tools and tips for self-advocacy, for medical solidarity, for knowing and understanding our rights. So those are a couple of resources. And then finally, if you are not receiving the care that you need, my organization, the Health Justice Commons, is actually in the first stage of launching a radical telehealth collective, which will enable people to get to work with practitioners online for free to meet immediate and urgent healthcare needs. So if you want to stay up to date about when we're rolling that out for the general public, we're kind of in like a stage 1 development phase where we're working with especially Black and Indigenous people of color who are disabled, queer, and trans to really refine our model. But you can just keep looking at our website for when we'll be starting to work with people, because that's another resource that we'll have available for our communities. So I hope that that gives you some concrete tools to support yourselves and your communities in these times. The next question is, I'm curious to hear about immobilization and isolation within the same context. Bessel van der Kolk discussed in a class last month the trauma and illness caused by isolation and immobilization. He discussed the need to organize in groups to prevent further trauma. Is this not part of the picture as well? I'm pretty sure that I'm understanding your question. I'm really glad that you brought up trauma and Bessel van der Kolk. I actually studied with him. And I think that his work and contributions are really important. I think maybe what you're speaking of and what Bessel van der Kolk was speaking of is that, you know, because we are in the context of the pandemic, we are experiencing a lot more isolation because of the needs of social distancing, and to some extent immobilization as well, for many different reasons, right? Like depending upon who we are, we might be afraid or unable, you know, to leave our homes safely because of COVID risk, because of risk of police violence, because of, you know, wildfire smoke, which is certainly an issue where I live here in Ohlone territory. So, you know, all of these things are creating an increased context for immobilization and isolation. And then, of course, oppression by its very nature causes those things, and it's meant to evoke those things. I think I spoke to that a little bit when I spoke of the collective punishment that's at play with this targeted, racialized police violence that's really quite horrific and lethal in nature. And when I talked about the Justice Project that's actually trying to communicate to people from the perspective of public health crisis, just how traumatizing it can be. So it certainly is part of the picture. And, you know, because of the needs of social distancing, it's hard for us to get together in groups like we might have at different moments, but there are other ways that we can connect, right? We can have Zoom gatherings or meetings or, you know, different ways that we can connect in these times. And, you know, when we do connect with each other, like even to just see one another's face, even if it's, you know, slightly delayed because of Zoom, to smile at one another, to look in one another's eyes, that is very regulating and soothing for the autonomic nervous system. So it helps bring ease to the body. It helps really down-regulate the sympathetic activation that's characteristic of immobilization. And also that might be activated due to isolation. Yeah, so just connecting with one another as we can, you know, down-regulate from the news cycle as much as you can. Obviously, it's crucial for us to stay informed. You know, knowledge can be power, but it can also be overwhelming, you know. So those are just some things in response to that question, which was excellent. I hope that that was valuable for you. So how can we support loved ones who are going through traumatic and oppressive experiences while struggling to receive care in the MIC? Yeah, that is a huge one. Yeah, I mean, hopefully you have learned some valuable information in this conversation tonight. I referenced several organizations and resources that could be valuable for you. There will be a replay available of the talk on the CIIS website. The podcast will be archived there. There'll also be a recording. I believe that there will be a transcript as well. You know, so you can cull some of the resources and just review things. I would say definitely validating the intensity of what they're experiencing is super important. that's just like one of the ways that we can really show up for people around kind of medical solidarity. Like, you are, particularly because the gaslighting is so prevalent, that's one of the biggest ways in which medical ableism is deployed. The gaslighting is terrible. So just reminding people like, hey, you are absolutely right to be angry, to be upset, to be frightened. Like, it totally makes sense. So that, this interaction that you had made you question yourself, your truth, they're wrong. So just remind them that those negative experiences were wrong, that they were unjust, that they deserved so much better. And sometimes you don't even have to say that to them. You just hold for them the awareness within you, like, you deserve so much better. Like, I love you and you deserve better. And we're going to get through this. Like, just kind of holding that as a truth, as a grounding, can be very powerful. And then I think really trying to identify the needs that a person has and then figure out which channels you need to work to get them. So say a person in your community needs to get a diagnostic test. Like, basically, like, who is the person that can say yes to that test? And then how can you basically, negotiate that labyrinth of the MIC and get to them so they can get that test? Or, maybe it's an equipment that they need. So, maybe it's a cane or a wheelchair or, a blood pressure monitoring device. Like, if you're not getting it quickly enough from the MIC, what other channels might you be able to explore? So there's a lot of mutual aid channels right now. Maybe there's one in your area. So those are other resources. There's Facebook community groups that might be valuable for you or your loved ones. There's Facebook groups of survivors. There's Facebook groups of people that are living with disabilities. There's specific ones for queer, trans, and non-binary people. Sorry about my dog, everyone. There's groups specifically for Black and Indigenous people of color. So there's, hopefully some of those things will be valuable. Yeah, and then, please feel free to contact me. You can reach me via the CIIS website. My email address is there. If you think that there's concrete ways that I might be able to support you or direct you to other resources or organizing that's happening. How do we implement learning about the medical and industrial complex into curriculum for pre-health students? That is a great question. I'm so glad that you asked that. My organization, the Health Justice Commons, we have an in-depth course called Understanding and Transforming the Medical Industrial Complex, parts 1 and part 2. It's probably about 20 to 30 hours of content, and we offer it as a 2-part 6 session course. And we have many people from many paths of life that participate in that course. This cycle, we actually just started a couple of weeks ago. We started on September 17th, and we have nearly 100 people enrolled in the course this cycle, which is like such a gift and so exciting. And at least half of the people enrolled in the course are people that are some type of healthcare worker. So either medical or nursing students or public health workers, or people that are already practicing as doctors or nurses or social workers. So this is an amazing resource. We would love to have you join us for the next cycle, which will be in early March. You could even probably join us this cycle if you reached out to me this week. But it will be offered again, and there's other organizations as a pre-health student that you might be able to join as well. Do No Harm, the Do No Harm Coalition I referenced, depending upon where you are geographically, or also perhaps a White Coats for Black Lives chapter, depending upon where you are. So there's a lot of organizations that are emerging right now for people to challenge and transform the medical industrial complex from within. I'll just say lastly that another thing that my organization does, the Health Justice Commons, is that we have a monthly gathering, a solidarity gathering for radical healthcare workers and healers. So our next one will actually be October 28th. And if you would like to join us, then you can just follow our Facebook page, our Instagram page, our Twitter feed, and you can get the information for the next gathering. We would love to have you. And we're just at, I think we're at Health Justice Commons for Instagram, and it's at HJ Commons for Twitter, and we're just Health Justice Commons on Facebook. I think we probably have time for 2 more questions, and then I think we might need to wrap for the evening. Is that accurate? I'm not sure. I'm going to take these 2 questions and see what happens after that. So what are ways you have affirmed your truth and worthiness for care while facing gaslighting in the MIC? That is a great question. I have armed myself with knowledge. That is how I have been able to get through the most challenging circumstances that I've experienced. I just basically came to the conclusion that I was going to have to be the quote unquote experts in the room, because the doctors with whom I interacted just were not actually going to understand the complexity of my health conditions. And actually, specifically in my situation, I'm a survivor of medical abuse as a consequence of treatment that I received within the medical industrial complex for treatment for scoliosis. And I'm also a survivor of radiation poisoning. So different aspects of my physiology just don't function differently as a consequence of some of the things that I've been exposed to, and I survived. So it took me a really long time to understand my own situation. I did a significant amount of research to really understand what was happening with me. I became very adept at functional medicine. And then I also, in some contexts then had to educate the healthcare workers that I was working with. And sometimes I asked them questions that they just couldn't answer. I was concerned about the risk of the high levels of radiation in a CAT scan that I had to have once as an emergency room procedure. And I was like, can you tell me how much radiation I'm going to be exposed to? Like, about how many airplane rides? I wanted it to be something that would be discernible to me, and would make sense to me. And they were like, you would actually have to ask a biophysicist that question. Like, we don't know, So I'm like, okay, obviously the precautionary principle in the way that I want it practiced is not happening in this moment, So I've used humor, I've used knowledge, I've used learning, myself, and I've actually engaged in learning with others as a way to organize and fight back. So I think that's a really huge way that I've been able to affirm my own truth and my worthiness in the face of the gaslighting of the MIC. And it's taken a long time. It's been a process. Like, please understand, because it's deep and it's cruel, and it's intentional. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that it's offered in deep solidarity and honoring whatever you're facing or others you love might be facing. And then it looks like our last question is, can you talk about your vision for a US healthcare system that would replace the medical industrial complex? Yes, I can. I mean, first I'll say that this vision, it necessarily needs to be collective. No one person can author or create this. It necessarily needs to be co-created. But I think for me, what I see, what I dream about is, some of what I talked about during the conclusion of my talk, where, we have networked healthcare cooperatives that are run by healthcare workers that are completely worker owned, and that there's a type of medical or healing pluralism that takes place inside these institutions that are co-ops, that are worker owned. So that means there's a horizontalism, or there's an equality of different types of practitioners, and that we've been successfully able to disrupt and transform a lot of the commodification and co-optation of indigenous or traditional healing methods. So that means, what I see is that there would be, I always use this example because I like the alliteration of the C's. So there would be like curanderas and cardiologists, working shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to shoulder with many other types of healers, and then people receiving care, not patients, because patient is indicative of a kind of invisibilized power dynamic, right? So people will be receiving care and providing care. There might be other language that we come up with that's more liberatory. So people could opt for a range of care to kind of address the issue that they're facing. They could get Olympia, or they could try homeopathy, or they could be like, what, like, I think I really need an EEG. My heart rate hasn't been right since the wildfires this season. There's maybe something going on. So I think so the horizontalism wouldn't just be among the different types of healers and the healing modalities that are available with equality and honor. And the power won't just be shared among healthcare practitioners, but also there will be an expertise that will be recognized, acknowledged, and honored from the person receiving care. Like, the reality is that like we actually are the most effective experts of our own bodies and health. Like, we live in here, right? Like, we know this better than anybody else, and I think the extent to which we don't is because of the way that our power to do so has been undermined, or we're so overwhelmed that we're actually in somewhat of a dissociative state. And some people have said, the state of settler colonialism, which is a process that we're still in. The United States is Turtle Island. It's still occupied but unceded indigenous land, so that this state, we're all in this state of somewhat dissociation. So there would have to be a lot of levels of healing that are happening simultaneously for there to be a complete supplantation of the MIC with new things. The economic system would need to change really significantly, and other forms of oppression would need to be challenged and transformed. But those are some of the characteristics, that there's really an autonomy of the person that's receiving care. There's worker-owned co-ops. There's this pluralism of different modalities. There's the cessation of commodification of care. And there's a way in which the wealth that's generated through healing is really equitably shared. It's not just like contained or enclosed within the pockets of these big pharma corporations or medical diagnostic companies, or no, that money is actually it's cycling into our communities and into it's feeding and supporting healthcare workers themselves. And then healthcare workers themselves, they're making these administrative decisions, right? There's not some higher up people disconnected from those providing care. Like, they actually, the people that understand what's most necessary have the power to make those decisions. So, and Cuba is a really great example of some amazing healthcare practices that exist in the world right now, and other countries as well. I hear stories all the time of people traveling internationally or who live in other parts of the world that have had really good healthcare in places like Belize or Thailand. I have a colleague who was living in Thailand for some time, supporting trans women communities there. And she told me, I had an injury. It was a compound fracture. And I went to see, a regular internist, and they, did some bandaging and they helped me out. And they said, actually, you need to see an orthopedist for this. So, I bandaged you up. I can tell you some self-care things. I'm going to make you an appointment right now. But, I'm not going to charge you for this, because an orthopedist is what you really need to see. Like, unheard of in the US, there was like this transparency, this humility, then not having to pay for care. I mean, it's just like, there's a way in which the people receiving care are much more centered in other contexts. So there's good healing happening all the time. We just have to make it more accessible, and we have to make it the more prominent paradigm. That was a very long answer. I hope that it was helpful. And I do think that we're probably getting towards time, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm going to look towards some of our esteemed CIIS team members to let me know if there's time for one more question. I don't have one in
that's actually our last question.
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. That was such a insightful and oh so relevant topic for these times. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. And before we close, I want to give a big thank you to our wonderful ASL interpreters, Brandon and Debbie, who did a wonderful job tonight. And thank you all so much for attending today. We hope that you will join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us, and good night.